So I want to spend just a little time talking about the cultural landscape in which we are going to learn, but more importantly, in which you will, as church leaders, use and ultimately, I believe, transform our church polity. There's a couple of reasons to do this. One is so that you are well prepared for the challenges that and opportunities that you and I face and will face as church leaders. It also, I think, is particularly helpful when we think about what are the opportunities for and to Presbyterian church polity in the coming years, given the number of changes that are happening in our cultural landscape and in our church landscape. It also will help situate some of our readings in the context of this class so that you can more fully understand why I'm asking you and having you read certain books, and two books in particular, the Canoeing the Mountains book and the Governance and Ministry book, that aren't explicitly about our Presbyterian polity. They're not directly about that, and one of them actually is not even written by a Presbyterian minister, but both, I think, are very, very helpful. The Book of Order context for this would come actually from chapter 2 of the Foundation section, where, and this is a popular, I would say, and well-used phrase, that the Church affirms Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda Secundum Verbum Dei. That is, the Church Reformed, always to be reformed according to the Word of God. And that's the quote, and then our Book of Order is added, in the power of the Spirit. So we are looking at not only learning how to utilize what's in the Book of Order, but also how and why would we continue to think biblically, critically, spiritually, and missionally about our polity. I want to start actually not with the books I'm having you read, but with a different author, Al Roxborough, and a couple of notes that he has made just to situate this. He notes that we have moved from an industrial age to a networking age. And so we lived in an industrial age where we thought about and built many, many machines and thought about organizations. So this is the important piece, thought about organizations according to a mechanistic way. And now we've moved into what he calls a networking age, where we think far more, say, creatively and interconnectedly about how organizations work. Much of our polity, and definitely our parliamentary guide, is from an industrial age. We still have Robert's Rules, and Roxborough actually even notes Robert's Rules on page 14 of Missional Map Making, that it's a sign of a holdover. And here it is it's really at the center of how many of our meetings function. And I think there's deep work to do in terms of thinking about what that means to have that in our polity. It's also the case that we've moved from, according to Roxborough, public prominence to privatized location, and that the church has seen and experienced this. The zenith of much of mainline Christianity in America was after World War II, where our churches were full and thrived at the center of many geographic locations and communities. This is breaking down. Christendom is going. That Christendom's is the moral and social imaginary of our society, and Constantinium, by and large, is gone. That's the former relationship between church and state. There's some vestiges of that. You may be invited to pray before the Commonwealth opens its representative session. We have a chaplain for the Senate, but by and large, that former relationship is really disappearing. And what he says is that it's even moved farther than that, that we've moved from the sidelines of the society to kind of floating in the middle. There's no more decentering of the church because there's not much of a center to our society. And I think you can see that play out in the political and moral conversations that flow in and around and through us, where it's hard to find any kind of common conversation for people to build coalitions that are broad enough to get much of anything done. He also says there's been a shift in expectations of a pastor. In modernity, the pastor was a teacher and a professional. Now we're a CEO, we're a coach, we're a counselor, and it kind of goes on and on. And again, it's not so much that it's shifted as much as it's just shifted and then it's expanded so much it's hard to find out what it means to be a pastor these days. And of course, our polity was written and designed, really, we were called teaching elders in it, and we work to function as professional moderators of a session. So there's lots of work to do for us to think about what it means to function according to our polity and what our polity means in a different cultural context. In terms of the books that you've read, let me just point out a couple of things from Hotchkiss. I would just want to note that he says polity is, and he used that word, polity is the advice of the founders about who best discerns direction and manages the mission. You've heard my definition of polity. It's not quite the same, but he's got a good point in terms of here we are passing down wisdom from generation to generation about who does what and how the mission is managed. And that certainly is what's going on in our polity. I think there's deeper, and I was trying to make the case that there's theological issues in play in our polity, and those are the things that I want us to learn how to attend to, because I think that's how we best continue to reform and manage how we do things. He says there's two problems with denominational advice, and by that I think he means polities, that it works best in a certain size, 140 to 400 in attendance, and he says below it, it doesn't work well for a certain number of reasons, and above it, it doesn't work well for a certain number of reasons. That resonates with my experience, and in smaller congregations, the formal structures to me often seem like they are clunky and binding and aren't intuitive to people. In larger structures, the larger congregations, the structures that we have maybe don't seem like they're nimble enough to be able to accomplish what people want to accomplish, and so there's real tensions there. He also says that polities are problem-centered. In other words, we've seen problems and then we fix them. We see problems and we fix them, and that creates a dynamic where we're always looking for problems. He notes that American congregations are influenced by American democratic culture, so no matter the polity, there's a strong tendency towards what he calls de facto congregationalism. Well, we have a polity that says we're not congregational, and so as we attend to our polity, it's, I think, helpful to note that that's part of our cultural landscape. And then he talks in pages 20 to 26 about the disestablished culture, the impact of work on time and expectations, a shopping ethos among people, attitude toward clergy that can particularly become reactive when there's times of tension. All that is, I think, really helpful information for us to sift through, think about as we both learn polity, learn how to use polity in particular contexts, because you'll be taking this polity and you'll be in a particular place, and it might be a small place, it might be a large place, it might be a place where there's 175 people in attendance and it really seems like everything fits. There is, what he says, is going to be a congregationalism, and no matter where we are, the amount of time people are spending working, the stories they bring from work to the church are all going to impact the way that the polity functions in that context. Congregations, according to Hotchkiss, are different than after World War II, and yet many of our expectations are formed by the congregations that were established and working well kind of in that era. And he says the world's different than Robert's Rules. It's similar to what Roxburgh is saying. But he also says, and I think this is really helpful for us, that congregations are different from what he says any other organization, particularly for two reasons. The people in them occupy multiple roles in the life of the organization. So they are the funders of the organization and the decision makers of the organization, and they also are the people who are enacting the mission of the organization, and they're also in many ways the people who are reaping many of the benefits of being a part of the organization. And those are all roles that in corporate America, and even in nonprofits, and make that even in nonprofits, that your funders are not often the same people who are making many of the decisions. There can be some overlap, but there's not always. And the leader in congregations, the clergy, occupies multiple roles in people's lives. I think this was, reading these two things for me really crucially helped me express two things that I've said in other contexts, but I think it's really important for leaders of congregations to know that we're people who baptize and then we show up to moderate a session meeting, and we're people who lead a funeral, but then we need to lead a staff. and there's these multiple roles in people's lives that we play, and navigating that is very, very important for us. Implications. This is from Bolsinger. He says adaptive processes don't require leadership with answers. It requires leadership that creates structures that hold people together through processes of addressing questions for which there are not easy answers. So it really becomes a question of, is our polity going to provide us answers, or is it going to provide us a structure for how we can hold together to answer what can be really, really difficult questions? And he also, quoting Peter Drucker, said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's that attention to the kind of culture we're building, and whether our polity is strategy or whether it's culture building. He says we need healthy organizational culture in order to thrive in uncharted places, and that we need to reclaim our core story in the face of adversity. And again, I'm trying to work on, for you, claiming polity as a core story, as culture, as structure, not just as strategy, answer, here's how we've always done it. And that's why we're reading both of those books, to help us work on those skills as we learn how to utilize the culture. I would invite you to kind of maybe press pause and just look at this in terms of what it means to do adaptive change. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there's the ways that we think about what we're facing and what we do in terms of what we're facing. In terms of history, you know what? Let me just be really quick about this. Starts with John Calvin, who had 4 church officers, doctors you'll see there, deacons who were doing particular functions, and ministers of the word. And that continued to move forward. John Knox studied with John Calvin. He takes his theology back to Scotland, reorganizes the church along Calvinist lines, a number of splits. The church for John Knox, and in Scottish theology, and you'll see it in the Confessions, is called the Kirk. The Kirk, not the Kirk, but the Kirk. In his polity, congregations were free to choose pastors, but they couldn't fire them. Congregations were hoped to be financially self-supporting. There were no bishops, but there were superintendents, and there was an emphasis on democratic decision-making, which we'll see as a thread through us, which, of course, in a democratic culture has particular implications for how people understand that. Next step was the Westminster Assembly, which produced the Westminster Confession of Faith, went from 1643 to 1649, met thousands of times. They could never agree on a church polity, which I think is important for us. So they landed on theology and not polity, which has had implications in terms of how people have understood the Presbyterian Church. Then there was the Adopting Act of 1729. Once Presbyterianism had come to America, where they were working on bringing people together across theologies, and they got a directory of worship, a form of government that was agreeable, earnestly recommended, but again, not a particular polity that came to be. In 1785, we got our first proposal for a form of government. It was rejected. No copy of it survived. 1788, we finally got a form of government. It's been revised ever since then. I think the implications of that for our polity are that there's a solidity to what you can see as you march through that, but it tends to be around the function of clergy and maybe the board of elders. There's a lot of change. You can see that we've been adapting to our present environment, and I think, particularly in that early stuff, you see that I think there's a need to adapt our ability to lead in our present environment. So that's why these other sources that are helping surround our understanding of polity, so that you're formed to understand the polity, to use it in a particular context. But I also want to invite you into the leadership task as you grow in ministry, to think about how our polity continues to adapt and grow and be shaped for the mission that we find ourselves doing now.